Right. So let's talk about neuronal pathways. So what I want to exemplify in our conversation about neuronal pathways. Remember, what we have is we have a brain, and it's going to be very primitive. We have spinal cord, right? And we have periphery. So we have sensory receptors. Say again? Well, thank you for the question. So I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I'm gonna repeat your questions so they can get on record. So the question was, are sensory receptors the periphery? In regards to nervous system, when we say periphery of the body, it's everything that is not CNS. So is your skin periphery? Yes. Is your heart periphery? Yes. Are your muscles periphery? Yes. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question, Joe? Good. So we have sensory receptors, and I'm going to specifically focus on muscles. And not just muscles, skeletal, okay? Because we will be talking about the pathways that involve muscle, okay? So the information from sensory receptors will go from the periphery to the CNS, to the spinal cord, or to the brain. Does that make sense? So the direction, look at this. If this is a sensory fiber, if this is a sensory pathway, in which direction the information is going to go? Look. Body, axle, body, axle, body, axle. So these pathways, the sensory pathways, are called ascending. Okay? Does that make sense? Let me widen spinal cord a little bit so I have space here. Now, how do we control skeletal muscles? We generate the signal in the motor cortex, send it down via pyramidal pathways or non-pyramidal pathways, via the spinal cord, and then to the muscle. So these pathways, the motor pathways, will be descending. So the direction of a signal will be upwards in the ascending pathways and downwards in the descending pathways. Descending. Okay, so to kind of summarize, sensory pathways that convey the signal from the periphery to the brain are ascending. Motor pathways that convey the signal from the brain to the peripheral muscles, skeletal muscles, are descending. Why skeletal muscle? You see where we start? We start in motor cortex, which automatically put us in the realm of skeletal muscles. We will talk about the visceral controls, the autonomic controls, in the last chapter of the unit 3. Do I make sense? We are talking more or less about sort of conscious stuff. So far, we're good? You following me? Now let's take a look at these pathways and identify some features. So some common features. Well, first of all, that I can tell you just right away. Well, first of all, these pathways are transmitting the signal. So since they are transmitting the signal, what type of matter are they going to belong to? Transmission of the signal is white matter. White matter, yes. So it's going to be white matter in your spinal cord. Does that make sense? Second, so let's put down some sort of common things here. White matter in the spinal cord, they are symmetrical. So no exceptions. If you have one pathway on the left side of the spinal cord, you're going to have exactly the same pathway on the right side of the spinal cord. Okay? Now, if you look at the number of neurons, I gave you an example. So there are 3 neurons in ascending. There are 2 neurons in descending. So in fact, ascending pathways may have 2 or 3 neurons, and descending pathways that control skeletal muscles always going to have 2. We're going to call it, they relay the signal. Does that make sense? They will relay the signal. They won't be one neuron running all the way from the brain to the muscle, or from the sensory receptor to the brain. Good so far? Finally, they may decussate. We used that word before. I am not sure about the spelling of the word decussate. I hope it's right. I don't know. The point is, decussation means crossing to the other side. Some of them do, some of them don't. I'm not asking which ones do and don't. I want you to know that some of them may decussate. Am I clear so far? Good? Let's talk about sensory pathways. Ascending pathways. 3 that you must know are dorsal, white, column. So I don't have my spinal cord here. It's probably the largest pathway right about here. Okay. This is my dorsal. So dorsal white column transmits sensations of, let me see if I have a better, sensations of vibration, touch. Okay. So basically, all vibration and touch are essentially the same, seriously speaking. Okay. And it has 3 neurons. Okay. Now, how do we call those neurons? We call them first order, second order, third order. So that synapse right here between the second and the third order neurons for the dorsal white column will be in the hypothalamus. That makes sense? Because hypothalamus, it, relays the information to different parts of the brain. Another one is spinal column. Now look at the name, spinal column. From spine to thalamus. Okay? In fact, it goes beyond thalamus. There are, same picture, 3 neurons, first, second, third order. Pain, temperature. Also 3 neurons. You good so far? And the third one is spinal cerebellum. Now, using that same approach, spinocerebellum, where does it go to? If it's spinocerebellum. Cerebellum, bingo, cerebellum. Now, first of all, 2 neurons. Second, do you consciously know what's going on in your cerebellum? You do not. Which means you have no idea what kind of signals. I mean, you know vibration, you know touch, you know pain, you know temperature, right? But this one, you don't really know. We call it proprioception. So your cerebellum would be receiving that unique information about the body position in space. Does that make sense? Joints, muscles, stuff like that. Good? Following me? So again, you can appreciate the signals that come through dorsal column, through the spinal column pathway, but spinocerebellar pathway, I mean, the mere fact that you're moving around tells everybody that it works, but you don't really consciously appreciate those signals. Because they end up in the cerebellum, you have no conscious appreciation of what's going on. That makes sense? Good? Okay. Now, descending pathways. Okay, so for the descending pathways, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to describe pathways that you must know, okay? And then we're going to have some talk about these pathways, about some like general features of motor, skeletal motor pathways. So we're going to start with the Portico spinal pathway. Okay. So corticus, all descending pathways have 2 neurons, right? No exceptions. Upper motor, lower motor, okay? Now, corticus spinal pathway conveys voluntary muscle movements. Does that make sense? Okay, so when you generate a movement pattern in your motor cortex, these movement patterns will be conveyed down here by cortical spinal pathway. Good? Neurons in this pathway, they decussate. Those are pyramidal neurons. It's like very separate tract. That pathway and tract are basically the same. We'll talk about the concept of tracts a little bit later. So far, we're good? Okay. Vestibular spinal pathway. By the term vestibular, you can already understand that we are talking about balance and posture. As we discussed before, you can't really voluntarily lose balance. You can't really like crumble and fall on the ground. So it just demonstrates that you really have not any control of your vestibular spine. Make sense? Depth of spinal column. Neck movements. Now, by neck movements, remember that visual reflex that we were talking about, following the moving object, your eyes, remember that? That's your, I mean, now it's cortical spine. But if I would be sitting at the basketball court and watching players moving, you know, right and left, like this, that's visual reflex. So that would be my tectospinal pathway. And a couple of less important, reticulospinal. Mostly muscle tone. And rubrospinal. That is maybe the least important pathway in us in humans. Some with muscle tone. So here you have 5 descending pathways. So far, you with me? Everybody's following? Now, before we move any further, I want to say, so what kind of question you can expect? Which of the following statements about reticulospinal pathways correct? This is the, and then I give you, this is the ascending motor pathway that controls your balance. So start reading and think, no, that cannot be the right answer, because if it's motor pathway, it cannot be ascending. That makes sense? Or I can say, oh, it's descending motor pathway, which controls your balance. You say, well, it is descending motor pathway, but it does not control your balance. See? So you're going to be, you should able kind of a description with the name of the pathway. Am I clear? Okay. Anatomically, you may have seen, you should have seen, the cross-section of the spinal cord in the lectures with all the pathways labeled. Seen that? I suppose. When you're going to have an exam, I promise that all the pictures that will be on the exam, just as we did last time, the first time, will be here on the screen. So, although you're going to have black and white images, you will have an access to color images right there. Does that make sense on the screen? So if you, I know that it's easier, I completely understand, it's totally fine. Okay? But anatomy is on you, I'm not talking about anatomy. That you have the pictures, you have the study guide. Go ahead. Any questions? Good so far? Okay. One thing that I wanted to say, which will be extremely relevant to both conversations about the damage to the spinal cord and to many other future conversations about nervous system, is this. So you have, again, brain, right? You have spinal cord, and you have a muscle. Are you following? And here you have two neurons. One and two. Okay? So this top neuron is called upper motor neuron. This one that extends from spinal cord to the muscle is called lower motor neuron. Now we're gonna discuss a really important concept. Lower motor neurons are always excitatory. What does that mean? It means that when they release neurotransmitter, which, as we will learn soon, is always a signal pole. That's not an example. When lower motor neurons release neurotransmitter, muscle contracts. Does that make sense? When they don't release, muscle doesn't contract. It sounds absolutely kind of, trivial. But why it is important? Turns out that upper motor neurons can be excitatory or inhibitory. Are you following? Now, what is that? Imagine that you engage the motor cortex here, engages a specific neuron that goes all the way down to the spinal cord. It's excitatory neuron, and it releases excitatory neurotransmitter that excites a particular lower motor neuron. That lower motor neuron will also release, it's excited, right? The result of excitation, lower motor neuron will release neurotransmitter, and what's going to happen to the muscle? When it's excited, it's going to contract. Now, another upper motor neuron, which is inhibitory, will release inhibitory neurotransmitter on some other lower motor neuron. What's going to happen to lower motor neuron if inhibitory neurotransmitter is acting upon it? That's like 0 out of 10 hard question. If inhibitory neurotransmitter acts on a neuron, what happens to a neuron? It is inhibited. Yeah, it's inhibited. Then it's hyperpolarized, it is inhibited. If it's inhibited, does it release any neurotransmitter? No. Why this is, in my opinion, super important? It shows you that your skeletal muscle works like a light switch, okay? So, I'm not going to take away, but these lights right here, you can either turn them, know that they can be dimmed. Let's forget about dimming, okay? They can be on or off. You cannot make them going darker than off. Does that make sense? Same is true for skeletal muscles. You can't make it like lower than 0. Because the only thing that can happen to your muscle is excitation. Is that clear? So when you are doing something, like when I lift this cup with this mug, muscles in my arm are excited. When I hang down my arm, they relax. There is no special signal for relaxation. There is no signal. Do you understand? Now, look why it is important. And we're going to get back to it when we talk about spinal cord injury. If you damage excitatory upper motor neuron, everything below will not be excited. Your muscle will not be able to contract. That makes sense? It will be totally relaxed all the time. You see what I'm saying? We call it flaccid paralysis. Polio, we'll talk about polio. Okay. Now, what if, well, actually, better example, I don't know if you've heard about botulism. In botulism, people develop flaccid paralysis because, for instance, in upper motor neurons, they can completely block transmission. See. An even better example of how this is important. Imagine that upper motor neuron is inhibitory. It's normal. We should have such neurons, right? Now you have some kind of a toxin that inhibits those inhibitory neurons. If you inhibit inhibition, what's going to happen down here? Huh? You inhibit, think of inhibition, think of inhibitory upper motor neuron as relaxing neuron. If you inhibit relaxing neuron, what happens to your muscles? They're going to contract all the time because there's no relaxation signal coming through the spinal cord. There is no signal stopping for the lower motor neuron. Does that make sense? Exactly, that's tetanus. The toxin of tetanus inhibits your inhibitory upper motor neurons. And people develop contractures in virtually entire body. That make sense? Any questions? Can't hear you. Cramping like in athletes? Yeah. No, athletic cramping is not neurological. It is a muscle feature. And it's I can tell it's multifactorial. Nobody knows that there's not a single study that would pinpoint a single reason for it. Majority of studies show that it's electrolyte imbalances, overexertion, undertraining basically, and in some extreme cases, lower levels of ATP. Most of the electrolyte imbalances, and it's multiple ions. It's not just sodium or potassium or calcium. Okay. Now this, let's talk about pathologies of the spinal cord. I'm getting better at feeding an ungodly amount of information into very restricted space. We did a micro lecture today. I fit entire lecture in one whiteboard. It was like every inch was read. Okay. Spinal cord injury. Essentially, when people say, not specifically break the back, you may have heard, people say, oh, I broke my back, I broke my vertebra. Can you still walk after it? Yeah, if you have a compression fracture, comminuted fracture, very common among gymnasts, especially they damage like lumbar vertebrae when they land poorly. It doesn't affect the spinal cord. It's fine. I mean, it's not fine. They not get paralyzed. Okay. So spinal cord injury. There can be a condition known as spinal shock when upper motor neurons, which I just destroyed, not completely like transected, not completely broken in pieces, but rather experience somewhat similar to concussion. Now, since we're talking about upper motor neurons, you can either have increased muscle tone. If you inhibit inhibitory neurons, your muscles become like really tense, okay? Or you can experience flaccid muscles, right? Spinal shock usually resolves in about 24 to 48 hours. Now, the stuff that we are interested in, it's called upper motor neuron syndrome, the consequences of the spinal shock. If you have a transection of the spinal cord, like broken, you can have two outcomes. It can be quadriplegia or paraplegia. So quadriplegia, roughly, again, it's very sort of, it varies to some extent, C1 to T6, okay? So what does that mean? If you have a transection of a spinal cord from somewhere between the first cervical vertebrae all the way down to about mid-thoracic, you're going to be quadriplegic, which means all four limbs are going to be affected. Does that make sense? If you go below T6, it's going to affect lower limbs. And basically, you can think of it this way. If you look at the spinal cord, let me grab spinal cord really quick. If you look at the spinal cord, okay, and there is transection somewhere here where my finger is. You see, all the nerves that are below the transection become useless because the signal doesn't go lower than my finger. Does that make sense? Signals go here, but not below. So nerves, for instance, in your lower thoracic or lumbar region that would control your legs and your abdomen, they're useless. Now, we're going to discuss today the features of organization of spinal nerves, which will explain why people, even with quadriplegia, often can use their arms. Okay? Basically, what I'm trying to say is that the severity of motor manifestations will depend on where the injury occurs. So for quadriplegia, if it occurs in the higher areas, in a higher cervical region, C2, C3, kind of that, does that make sense? The person will most likely be paralyzed from neck down to everything, okay? If it occurs a little lower, like lower cervical, the person often retains control of the upper limbs. Control is not going to be full, but it can be quite extensive. So I have a couple of examples. I have a couple of friends, one in Russia, one in the United States, North Carolina. Both of them are quadriplegic as the result of car crash. Okay, both of them can use their arms. They cannot use their fingers to full extent. Okay, I mean they can write, they can drive, they can shoot, but I don't know. Let's play piano. No, they don't have that kind of ability. That makes sense. And I once saw a buddy of one of those friends who had an injury in the upper cervical. He was totally lucid, great guy, but completely paralyzed. He had to be in a motorized, like couple of fingers allowed him to operate the motorized wheelchair. He could not lift the arm, stuff like that. That makes sense? Now, paraplegia again, depends on where the injury is. You can lose control over legs, or some internal organs can be affected, like your ability to defecate or your ability to urinate. For instance, in some cases, for people with some specific spinal cord injury, they may lose control over the blood. Okay, so they have to have a catheter. So far, does that make sense? So that's spinal cord injury. I'm going to put ALS here, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, degradation of the lower motor neurons. Okay? I mean, what can I say? You know, Lou Gehrig's disease, you have seen Stephen Hawking, okay? He had ALS and he lived unconventional long life. Usually patients with ALS die much earlier. He lived way into his 70s. Basically, people retain lucidity, complete lucidity, but they develop extensive paralysis, virtually all the muscles. Okay? The underlying reasons: hereditary, probably; environmental, probably. We don't really know the mechanism. Okay. Of course, I couldn't go without polio, which is the viral infection. It's actually abnormal. So normally, poliovirus infection will manifest itself as fever and myalgias, and you'll be fine. But 1 out of 200 infected people develop paralysis. Virus replicates in your gut, then it jumps into the neurons, and it travels backwards. Does that make sense? So it travels from axonal terminals to the dendrites, to the body of a neuron, and it essentially infects lower motor neurons. And bodies are, as you remember, in the ventral cords, the spinal cord, and it destroys those lower motor neurons. That's it. Paralysis. Due to the location of the intestine, usually it affects lower limbs. So people develop flaccid paralysis. In some cases, it can ascend, it can affect neurons in your sort of phrenic nerves, so diaphragm stops moving. So then, or not completely, so post-paralysis of respiratory muscles. And then people need some respiratory. Make sense? Luckily, we have no polio in the United States because we have vaccines. Okay, so paradoxically, we still have to do those vaccines to keep polio away. But vaccines totally. And finally, I'm going to put it in the lovely pink color. I put it under Spina Bifida, okay? But I want to be clear. So technically speaking, it's developmental abnormalities. Does it make sense? So like ALS, that's the disease of adults. Polio, the disease of, anyone who contracts the virus. Spinal cord injury is a disease that is caused by an accident. Spina bifida is a condition that is caused by developmental abnormality. The fact that neural tube does not develop properly. So your nervous system starts its development as a neural tube. Okay. So this part right here is going to be brain. And this part right here is going to be spinal. Image. So far, are you with me? So what if the brain portion doesn't develop or develops abnormally? Two conditions that I want you to know. They are kind of self-explanatory. One is anencephaly. An means no. Encephaly, brain. Quite literally, those newborns have either grossly underdeveloped brain or practically not formed any cortex, no brain, basically. Different degrees of severity can be. Yes, it is lethal. Usually, those newborns die in the first few days after being born. As far as I know, the longest time such a newborn was maintained alive was 2 years and 10 months. It's lethal. So physiologically, you can maintain alive, but all higher functions are gone. Microcephaly. The microcephaly is a small size of the brain. Okay, so brain does not grow to its normal size. Skull is significantly reduced. You often can see what's called ventricular megaly. So ventricles become enlarged. Does that make sense? There are standards. You may have heard about microcephaly when there was an outbreak of Zika virus infection in 2017, I want to say. Ballpark, I don't know. About that time. That makes sense? A lot of mothers who were infected with Zika ended up giving birth to microcephaly kids. Kids will survive, but it is a lifelong debilitating condition. It's handicapping condition. And not just it's handicapping, people with microcephaly will require a lifelong attention. They cannot live independently. Okay? Now we're going to get to Spina Bifida. So first is Spina Bifida occulta. Look at the spinal column. You see those posterior aspects of spinal vertebra. See those? Each vertebra kind of looks like this. Okay? My thumbs kind of represent the body of the vertebra, the thick part, and my fingers represent the process, the spinous process. And that is the foramen where you have the spinal cord. Okay? Now imagine that this part of the vertebra is gone. It's gone. Does that make sense? Now, if it's just gone and that is it, and you can't see it, obviously you can't because, there's muscles and skin. This is called Spina Bifida. Most of the time it happens in the lower thoracic lumbar region, but I actually had I wouldn't say it's a really privilege. When my kids were in elementary school, they played football. And they had a game, and he had an opposing team. He tripped, just tripped. He wasn't even tackled. He fell on the ground, and he hit his hand, and he got paralyzed. It was a pretty terrifying experience. He was helicoptered to the hospital, and I asked some folks, what's going on? Is this kid better? He basically got the spinal shock, and it turned out that he was missing a huge chunk of one of his cervical vertebrae. So he had cervical spina bifida contact. He didn't know. He was playing a freaking football. When they discovered it, they told him, of course, no contact sport ever. Because you have an unprotected part of the spine. Okay? Now, two types of spina bifida that I want you to know in addition to spina bifida contact. One is called meningocele. So the term cele usually refers to abnormal protrusion. For instance, varicocele refers to abnormal protrusion of a vessel, like sticking out the wall, okay? So if this is your spinal cord, okay? This, the green is meninges, and the blue is, well, that's the spinal column. So that's your spinal cord. Blue is the spinal cord, okay? In meningocele, meninges protrude. Does that make sense to you? Only meninges. So I don't remember, I might have an image in the lecture notes. I don't know if I have. So basically, if you would look at newborn with meningocele, you will see kind of, a bubble of sorts, usually in the lumbar region, filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Conditions like that, of course, they impede the proper flow of CSF. Does that make sense? They may lead to hydrocephalus. They may lead to compression of the spinal cord and problems with limbs, problems with digestive system, so on and so forth. That make sense? Now, more severe condition is myelomeningocele. So in this case, that's your spinal column. Meninges protrude, okay? But look what happens to the spinal cord. You see what happens? Spinal cord protrudes into that bubble as well. Does that make sense? Obviously, this is much more severe condition, and complications may range from, say, hydrocephalus to developmental abnormalities, long-term disabilities, and motor disorders. Cognitive disorders, cognitive disabilities, and so on. That makes sense? So, these 5 conditions, developmental conditions, I want you to know. There are more in the lecture. These 5. Am I clear? We're good? Any questions on this one? No? Okay. To make this absolutely clear, this is where material for the next exam ends. Does that make sense? Exam next week on Thursday will cover right up to here. What we're going to start talking now and what we're going to talk about in the second half of the class will not be on that exam. So, having said that, let's talk about nerve, a nerve, and the structure of a nerve, and the whole concept of spinal and cranial nerves. Very well. So each nerve will consist of multiple axons, bunches of axons. Okay. So here's the structure of a nerve. You have, like, this dot is an axon. Okay. Cross section of an axon, all the proper cell membranes, blah blah blah. Each axon is gently wrapped into endomysium. And endomysium and the neuron. I keep saying endomysium. That's not possible. And the neuron. A bunch of individual axons wrapped in the endoneurium, wrapped in the next layer of connective tissue called perineurium. Now, this structure, several axons bundled together, is called fascia. You with me so far? Fascia. Does the word fascicle sound familiar? Like by sound? Or does it remind you? Fascicle. You know fascists? You know fascists. The word fascist. Somebody is fascist. You know what? No. Well, in Germany they had Nazis, but in Italy they had fascists. So fascist, the symbol for fascism was a bunch. You know that story about how hard it is to break a bunch and how easy it is to break each individual stick? That was the symbol. Fascicle is a bunch in Latin. And then several fascicles all together, surrounded by epineurium, will form a nerve. So one more time. Axons wrapped in the endoneurium, bunch of axons wrapped in the perineurium form fascicle, bunch of fascicles wrapped in epineurium form a nerve. Okay? Now, before we move any further, I want to clarify and kind of delineate some of the anatomical terms so they can be used properly. So in the CNS, harking back to CNS. In the CNS, gray matter, if it's not in the cortex, gray matter is usually called nucleus. So remember, we talked about how gray matter is assembly of neuronal bodies. Remember that? That's nucleus. When you hear terms like in a brainstem, I believe, red nucleus or olivary nucleus or anterior geniculate nucleus, all kind of nuclei. Nucleus, all it means is that it's the bunch of neuronal bodies. It's the little bundle of gray matter. Does that make sense? White matter in CNS is called a tract. So we use the word pathway for spinal cord, but you will see a lot of times descending tracts, ascending tracts, corticospinal tract, spinothalamic tract. Does that make sense to you? In the peripheral nervous system, gray matter, essentially the assembly of neuronal bodies will be called ganglia, ganglion. Ganglion is singular, okay? And white matter is a nerve. Does that make sense? So if I say, and blah, 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 synapse in periorbital ganglion, realize, since it is a ganglion, it is still peripheral nervous system. It's not in the CNS yet. Does that make sense? But if I tell you synapses with next neuron in the olivary nucleus, that's in the CNS. Does that make sense? Okay, just to clear it up. So, when we talk about nerves, we often use two terms interchangeably, which is not 100% correct. We use the term nerve and we use the term fiber. So let's clarify. Axon or neuron, or we'll say neuron. Neuron is an individual cell. Very cool. Nerve is an anatomical structure. This is a nerve. Am I clear? When we use the word fiber, we refer to a little bit ephemeral concept of few neurons going in the same direction. Does that make sense? Now, let me ask you this. I'm going to ask. So, if we talk in terms of periphery and CNS, in this case spinal cord, that's it, CNS. Sensory signals. What is the direction of sensory signals? From to? All of them. Not yet. So periphery CNS from give me a direction. Periphery CNS from to. From what? Okay, periphery spinal cord, sensory inputs. Already told you, inputs. They go from where? They go from periphery to the spinal cord. Does that make sense? Motor outputs go from spinal cord to the periphery. Is that clear? So we can say that fibers or neurons, that's more of a reminder, can be afferent sensory or efferent or motor. Make sense? So, okay, good. And I have to bring spinal cord into the play again because it's much easier to illustrate the whole concept. So this is the anterior portion, this is the posterior, okay? So you see this white rootlets here. The couple. Oh yeah, you got it? Cool. Okay. So you see this yellow rootlets? Remember, the dorsal part is about sensory, right? So signals that go through these rootlets, they will go into the spinal cord. Does that make sense? Now, the ventral part right here is all about motor. So signals here will go from the spinal cord. But look what happens to this strictly sensory rootlets, dorsal roots, and strictly motor rootlets, ventral roots. In the nerve right here, they join. Does that make sense? I usually compare it to a two-way street. On the same street, you have, like on I-90, you have lanes going eastbound and lanes going westbound. They are separated, right? So in a nerve, you can have neurons or fibers being afferent and getting signals to the CNS. You got it? And neurons or fibers being efferent, taking the signals out of CNS. Each fiber, each neuron is either one or another. They do not change function. It's impossible. But nerve with both afferent and efferent fibers is called mixed. Makes sense, right? Now, do you have purely sensory nerves? You do. Do you have purely motor nerves? Very few, if any. I cannot name any purely motor nerve from the top of my head. Okay, purely. You're going to have some nerves that are more motor. Does that make sense? But the majority of nerves are mixed. We good? Now, can you, if you have a patient with spinal cord injury, complete transaction, which led to paraplegia, this patient cannot operate his or her legs. Will this patient ever walk again? No. Based on our current medical knowledge, no. Okay? Now, another question. I present you a real case, which happened in late 80s, I believe, back in the Soviet Union. 4-year-old girl decided to take the dress out of the washing machine. Back then, hardcore Soviet washing machines did not stop. They opened the lid. They just kept it moving. You know, like now, if you want to open the lid, you have to press the button, you have to wait until the drum stops completely. You cannot open the lid. Back then, I did it myself. I was a little bit grown up. You can open the lid, it's fine. And the drum will keep on going. Okay? So she opens the lid and she decides to pull the dress. So battle between the 4-year-old girl and the washing machine wins. And as a prize, she claims that girl's arms. She rips them out completely. That girl had her badass grandma who heard it, ran into the bathroom, grabbed the girl, grabbed the arms, put the arms on ice, patched the girl so she doesn't bleed out, and took her to the emergency room. The girl was immediately rushed to ER, where they reattached both arms. And guess what? After recovery time, rehabilitation therapy, she regained the control of her arms. Were some nerves damaged? No shit, but they regrew. That's the difference between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. Axons, neurons of peripheral nervous system can regrow with some restrictions. So how does that happen? Imagine that this is a neuron, okay? Peripheral nervous system. So we've got myelination here. Schwann cells provide myelination, okay? Now, I'm not going to draw a gazillion different versions, okay? So first, you have a damage. Now, restriction. If you damage the body, that's it. Neuron's gone. no restoration, done. But if you damage axon, and that's what nerve is, right? That's what nerve is. You damage axon, what happens first? The distal part here, it's useless. Okay? So this part gets totally destroyed. Its normal macrophages will come over and just wipe it out. Clear? And then Schwann cells will start producing so-called adhesion molecules. And these adhesion molecules, Schwann cells, it's called regeneration tube. So Schwann cells will form the tube. On the inside surface, there will be adhesion molecules, and those adhesion molecules will drive the regrowth of axon. Does that make sense? Now, it all looks pretty hunky-dory. There is one extra restriction. Not so much a restriction as just a feature. So axon grows back, but it doesn't grow back in the same exact pathway. You see what I'm saying? So it may take slightly different routes. And that explains why your nervous system does not regain the same control over your muscles. So basically, although you can start like moving your arms that were reattached, you need physical therapy to just, completely rehabilitate. But it's doable. It can be done. Now, question why we cannot do the same with, say, spinal cord. Why can't we just decapitate someone and then reattach the head? Oligodendrocytes in central nervous system, the Schwann cell analogs, actually produce proteins that seem to inhibit this process. Did it grow? That makes sense? And also astrocytes are notoriously good at forming scar tissue. Makes sense, right? So, I mean, that's kind of unfortunate. Grow back the hair. It's fine. Maybe questions? Okay, let's take a break. We'll come back. I will do the review of cranial and spinal nerves really quick. And we should have some time for a brief overview of the cranial. Right. So what I wanted to do about the cranial nerves, obviously I'm not going to draw any anatomy on the board. I wanted to kind of lay out main characteristics of cranial nerves. They all originate in the cranium, except for one, they all originate in the brain or in the spinal cord, in the brainstem. Okay, so there are 12 of them, and we're going to list them just to show you that it is possible. So the first is olfactory nerve. Then we have optic nerve. Then we have, you don't have to write it down because I just want to have a list so I can kind of characterize them. Oculomotor nerve. Then we have trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibular cochlear, those are Roman numerals. Vestibular cochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and epicondyle. Okay. I think I give in the notes, I give a mnemonic rule that gives you the list of the first letters. On occasion, our trusty truck acts funny, very good vehicle anyhow. Okay, first letters. There are some kind of, association techniques that you can play. Now, do you need to memorize the nerve and the number? No. So good news for you, no. You kind of, well, it will help when you look at the anatomical location of those nerves. Does that make sense? So if I would look at the bottom here, the bottom of the brain, you don't have to grab, I'll just show you. So they are numbered as you go from here all the way down here. So olfactory nerve, number 1, optic nerves, number 2, then trochlear, it's kind of not trochlear, kind of there in the back. Oculomotor, then trochlear, then trigeminal, then abducens, and you just kind of go in a certain pattern. Does that make sense? And you can follow all those nerves the way they are lined up in your brain or in your brain stem. Does that make sense? This is why they are numbered this way. What I want to focus right now is whether or not the nerves are sensory, motor, or both. And what is the main function? Okay? Function, dysfunction, how you can test it. So it's going to be fairly quick. Olfactory and optic nerves. This olfactory nerve, smell, optic nerve, vision. Now tell me, are they sensory, motor, or both? Smell and vision. Sensory, of course. Purely sensory nerves, okay? Now, how do you know that olfactory nerve doesn't work? You cannot smell it. Am I clear? You have no smell sensation. For instance, it can be a result of fractured ethmoid bone, preformed plate of ethmoid bone, which will damage your olfactory nerve and will lead to a loss. You probably have heard that anosmia, inability to sense the smell, is one of the symptoms of coronavirus infection, coronavirus-induced disease. It is true, but it's not because of the nerve. Okay. Case of vision, if it's damaged, you go blind. Okay. I must say that you have two nerves of each kind, so two olfactory nerves, two optic nerves, two oculomotor, so on and so forth. Am I clear? Oculomotor, trochlear abducens. Eye movements, abducens, eye movements. By eye movements, I mean, moving your eye left, right, up and down. Oculomotor also is responsible for things like pupil dilation and control of the shape, the lens in your eye. Do I make sense so far? Now, these nerves, eye movement, eye movement, eye movement. Sensory motor. Movement. If it's motor, I already said it. So motor nerves, motor nerves, motor nerves. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Dysfunction of those nerves, you can't move your eye in a particular direction. Do I make sense? If oculomotor damage, Specifically, your pupil will not dilate or constrict. So if you will, shine the light into somebody's eye and pupil doesn't constrict, it suggests that oculomotor nerve is down. We're clear. Trigeminal. I don't know where to start. Okay, I'm going to put both. And I will just explain what it controls. So trigeminal, sensory component, your entire face. Am I clear? Specifically, the touch sensation from your entire face, from your teeth, from your tongue, not the taste, the touch. Does that make sense? When you go to a dentist and they give you anesthesia, they numb the branches of the trigeminal nerve that innervate your teeth. They numb the branches of trigeminal nerve that innervate your tongue. Does that make sense? This is why you feel that numbness. Good? Now, motor branch of trigeminal nerve, chewing. Good? I didn't put anything, it's just too much. Facial nerve, also both. So facial nerve, its motor component controls your facial muscles. When you blink, when you smile, that's facial nerve. And it also controls many glands. Lacrimal gland, nasal gland, parotid salivary gland, all are under control of the facial nerve. That makes sense. So, how would you test facial nerve functionality? You want to check the motor component, tell the person to make faces, okay? You want to check the sensory component, get something bitter, put it on the anterior part of the tongue. Clear? So how would you check for trigeminal? Poke into the face with some sharp object. Does that make sense? Or ask person, if you want to test motor component, ask person to chew. Good? Now, pathology is associated with these nerves. For trigeminal, it's a tic douloureux, inflammation of trigeminal nerve, extremely painful condition. Usually the result of inflammation of a nerve or some structure pressing on it can be fixed surgically. Pathology of the facial nerve is so-called Bell's palsy. If the entire nerve is paralyzed, half of your face will get paralyzed. Usually also a result of inflammation, treatable, but a lot of patients, they have some residual symptoms even years after it mostly resolved. Vestibular corpora, well, that's easy. Hearing. Okay. Now, glossopharyngeal. Both motor and sensory. So sensory component, glossopharyngeal nerve conveys taste from the posterior third of the tongue. Does that make sense? Like deep there. It conveys the sensation of stretch from your pharynx, pharyngeal, so tongue, glossal, pharynx, pharyngeal. Are you with me so far? It also senses the concentration of oxygen in your blood by the nerve endings located in the carotid sinus. Now that's sensory part. What about motor part? Glossopharyngeal nerve controls two salivary glands, submandibular and sublingual. That makes sense? And it also mediates gag reflex. That's the most common way to check the functionality of glossopharyngeal. Check if the person has a gap or swallow. So far, we're good. Vagus nerve. Probably the most important cranial nerve. It controls practically all organs of the thoracic and abdominal cavity. Does that make sense here? So, for instance, look at this. When you eat something, food ends up in your stomach. Your stomach gets stretched. You with me so far? That stretch, the signal for that stretch is sent to medulla oblongata by a vagus nerve. And then the response to start moving food around is delivered to the stomach by a vagus nerve as well. Does that make sense? Vagus nerve innervates your heart, your lungs, your stomach, your pancreas, your small intestine, all the way to the pelvic cavity. Pelvic cavity is separate, okay? Abdominal and thoracic, all organs are innervated by a vagus nerve. Good? Accessory motor nerve. It's kind of weird nerve. If you would look at the spinal column, you see this red, I don't know, wire. That's the accessory nerve. It actually originates in the spinal cord, not in the brain, but it ascends into the cranium and then descends from the cranium, and it controls muscles of the neck and trapezius muscles. So it is responsible for elevating and depressing your shoulders and for rotating your head and tilting your head. Does that make sense? This is why it's more. And finally, hypoglossal, which is also motor. Hypo, under, glossal tone. Okay? So it's under the tone. It controls your tone movements. We good so far? Now let me go over the testing and then add one more concept. I'm not going to write anything, it's just olfactory. How you check if the person can smell something? Give them something smell. Ammonia, coffee, I don't know, perfume, something. Does that make sense? Vision, well, close your eyes, one eye, look with another. Can you see something? Filomotor, trochlear abducens. How you check those nerves? Person has to follow the object. Yes, absolutely. You can, for oculomotor specifically, light in the eye. I'm not going to focus on like which exact movements will be affected by trochlear and abducens. Trigeminal, sensory nerve, I already said, poking in the face. Facial, make grimace or put something on the anterior bone. Vestibular cochlear, can you hear? Oh, also balance. Actually, it's kind of an interesting thing. So cochlear part will transmit signals responsible for hearing, and vestibular part will transmit signals responsible for maintenance of balance. That makes sense? And actually, I know a case when a person developed a benign tumor, very small tumor in the brain, benign, that presses on vestibular cochlear nerve, that messes up the signaling. The person has often vertigo because kind of balance. So, glossopharyngeal, demonstrate the gag reflex, or put some taste in the back of the tongue. Vagus nerve. There's some problem with the vagus nerve. The person will have a whole bunch of problems. The good thing, vagus nerve also participates in the control of the gag reflex as well, so you can use this. And it also controls your vocal cords. So if there is some sudden change to your voice, that may be vagus nerve. Accessory nerve, throat, hypoglossal, stick the tongue down. Does that make sense? What can you expect on the exam? You can expect match the nerve and the function. Or I can give you kind of a clinical example. Like you have a patient that blah, 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 blah. No pupil constriction. Which nerve is affected? The patient who cannot hear, which nerve is affected? That makes sense? Okay, so that's your cranial nerve. Oh, before we move on, you see here is motor, motor, motor. Now let me ask you this. If you will close your eyes, you can try. Close your eyes and move your eyes like left, right, up, down. At every moment, do you know where your eyes are? Like which direction they are, quote unquote, looking, although your eyes are closed. Do you know? All these nerves, oculomotor, trochlear, abducens, accessory, hypoglossal, all those motor nerves, they have that tiny, tiny little proprioceptory component. For instance, I'm not looking at my shoulders, okay? But I know that they are elevated because those tiny little sensory branches in my accessory nerve send the signals back to my brain saying, dude, your shoulders are elevated. We just elevated it. Does that make sense? Like you don't see your tongue, but you know exactly where your tongue is, right? Because of that tiny little proprioceptory component, the hypoglossal. We're clear. For our intents and purposes, we count it as a motor, and there's a rule. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter most. Okay. Okay, let's do spinal nerves and dermis. Now, again, the pictures, well, it's kind of way ahead of us, but the pictures, you know, the pictures are in the PowerPoint, the pictures are in the study guide. So that's what's going to be on anatomy. You have anatomy study guide. That's what I can ask. I'm going to focus mostly on organization of spinal nerves and on some functional features. Okay, first of all, the spinal nerve, each spinal nerve can you see that spinal nerve? Just take a glance. You can see that it starts to branch right here. Can you see that? So these branches are called rami. I'm going to put the word in the corner, don't worry. And it's in the left. So ramus is singular. Rami is plural, right? It literally means branch. Good? Understood? So if you look at this particular model, this is the dorsal ramus. It goes back. And this is the ventral ramus. It goes forward. Does it make sense? So dorsal rami innervate your back. That's it. and they actually innervate relatively kind of a smaller area. Ventral rami innervate your limbs, your chest, your abdomen, legs. That's all ventral. Does that make sense to you? Spinal nerves are organized in plexuses. I will explain what it means. Do not think that, for instance, this spinal nerve right here, okay, will specifically innervate just only this nerve, will control your fingers. That makes sense? Doesn't work this way. We are here at Kirkland, and I tell you, you need to get to Cleveland. Like main campus. How would you get it? You can take I-90, then take exit to MLK, get there to MLK, right? You can take I-90 and get off early, or later. They take local roads, or you can turn on 271, right? And get on 271, then Cedar or Mayfield, and get there. Or you can take 306 and then turn Fairmount Boulevard. I mean, there are so many options, right? So you can get from point A to point B by a gazillion of different routes. That makes sense? So if one route is closed, you can always take another. You clear? Same is the idea of plexus. It means that each spinal nerve branches, and its branches innervate multiple muscles. And vice versa, each muscle is innervated by branches of many nerves. Does it make sense? For instance, so there are several plexuses. We have cervical plexus. Traditionally, it is C1 to C4. Can include some branches from C5. Brachial plexus C5 to T1. Then you have thoracic nerves. They are not organized in plexus. Lumbar plexus, L1, L5, and sacral plexus. So look at what I'm trying to show. The cervical plexus. Two nerves, and so a couple of disclaimers. There are some cutaneous nerves, basically sensory nerves, that are formed in each plexus and not focused together. For instance, there is a lesser occipital nerve. It basically tells you what it senses from. That makes sense? This area, back of your neck, okay? Or greater auricular around your ears. I'm going to be focusing on motor branches. Am I clear? So two nerves in the cervical plexus which you must know functionally are ansa cervicalis. It controls muscles, deep muscles of your neck that move your tongue and hyoid bone, the bone responsible for difference in speech. Are you with me so far? And phrenic nerve. Phrenic nerve, great example of why spinal nerves are organized in plexus. Phrenic nerve controls one of the most important muscles in the human body, the diaphragm. Muscle that separates your thoracic and abdominal cavities. When it's contracting, it moves down, and you inhale. Does that make sense? You with me? Now, imagine, and as far as I remember, phrenic nerve contains fibers from C1 to C4. I'm not sure about that. I'm not asking you to know. The point is, if you have some kind of a damage to your first cranial nerve, will it affect your diaphragm function? If it will, very minimally, because you have unaffected C2, C3, and C4 that will deliver the signal to diaphragm anyway. Does that make sense? This is why plexus is so important. You see what I'm saying? And this is why people with a transection in the cervical area, transection of the spinal cord, can still control their arm. Do you understand? If some nerves can deliver to the arms, it's okay. Good? So ansa cervicalis, phrenic nerve. Phrenic nerve controls that. Brachial plexus is a nightmare in terms of the anatomical organization with all those cords and trunks, and we're not doing that. Which nerves of the brachial plexus you must know? We're going to start with the shoulder. Axillary nerve. There you go. It innervates your shoulder muscles. Does that make sense? Musculocutaneous. Muscles of the flexors of the upper arm. In normal people's term, your biceps. So if your musculocutaneous nerve gets mangled, you won't be able to flex. Does that make sense? Good? Then you have two nerves of the forearm, like lower forearm. Median and ulnar. I'm in anatomical position. Okay, now look at me. Median nerve will run approximately here and will be responsible for flexion of your wrist and first two fingers. Ulnar nerve will run medially and will be responsible for this. Now look at Benjamin. To Benjamin, that's ulnar. Ulnar nerve runs right about ulnar. Can you see that little bone? If we were created by God, then God did some pretty stupid shit over here. Because ulnar nerve runs right here, next to that bump. Okay? It's called medial epicondyle. Okay? And if you hit medial epicondyle against something solid, and nerve will get stuck between medial epicondyle and that solid, that's your funny bone. Make sense? Basically, you press the bone, depress the nerve, and it gets like paralyzed immediately for some time. And your arm like that. Got it? Now, these nerves, the median and ulnar, they will be responsible for flexing your wrist or making a fist. A massive nerve that basically controls all posterior muscles of your arm, upper arm extensors and forearm extensors. So triceps and all extensors here is a radial nerve. A pretty common condition. So radial nerve will be responsible for this. Does that make sense? And if you do something bad with the radial nerve, what your hand is going to do this. It's called a hand ball. Make sense? And last nerve in that one that I will want you to know is pectoral. Well, the name says everything, right? Controls your pectoralis major. Movements like flexion of your shoulders. Are you with me so far? Good. Thoracic nerves, thorax, some parts of the abdomen, upper abdomen. That make sense? Lumbar plexus. Okay, femoral. Obturator. Femoral. Femoral nerve. I mean, you barely can probably see me on camera, you can't. But it controls the anterior thigh. Does that make sense? So it is responsible for extension of your knee, basically for kicking. You want to kick a soccer ball, that signal goes through the femoral. Does that make sense? Obturator nerve goes through that foramen, massive foramen in your hip bones called obturator foramen. It controls the medial surface of your thighs. Does that make sense? And allows you to do to adduct your leg. Look, this move. Put your legs together. Okay? The intra-femoral nerve will come in handy when we will discuss reflexes. The intra-femoral nerve specifically innervates muscles in males that it's reflex that will be very noticeable in males. Clinical importance. Muscles that ascend and descend testicles. That makes sense? The two muscles, dartus and cremaster muscles. When they contract, testicles are pulled into the body. When they relax, testicles descend out. Basically, they are in the scrotum. So the intra-femoral nerve sends the signals to those muscles. Sacral plexus. Pudendal, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about sciatic. So, pudendal nerve. This nerve innervates your genitalia. We're talking about mucosa in the genitalia, so it controls muscles of the pelvic floor, but importantly, all sensory input from genitalia in men or women goes through the pudendal. Make sense? Sciatic. Largest nerve in human body. I bet you heard about it. Did you? Okay. So, sciatic nerve. Trying to think how to. I mean, I don't want to jump on the table because I have a camera on. So I will try to show it on myself. Don't freak out. So sciatic nerve basically goes all the way in the back of your leg all the way down to your knee, back, popliteal region. Am I clear? So posterior thigh. Okay? In the popliteal region, it splits. Strictly speaking, it was split in the very beginning. It's two nerves together. One is tibial. Another one is common tibial. Okay, now, this will require some imagination. Don't hesitate to move your legs around just to understand what's going on. So sciatic nerve that goes right here. Okay, right here. Your buttock and posterior thigh, okay? What does it control? Which movement? Well, your buttocks control this. Okay? I mean, it's not the most common movement. We don't usually do specifically this, but it kind of explains. So it controls the extension of your hip. Good? And it also controls your hamstrings, which flex your knee. Does that make sense? Now, I'm going to use it's going to be easier. I'm going to use my hand and my forearm as the replacement for the leg. Okay, you with me? So tibial nerve, after tibial and common fibular split, tibial nerve remains kind of in the back of your lower leg. So tibial nerve will remain here, while fibular, common fibular nerve will remain kind of here. Does that make sense? You follow me? So what tibial nerve does, look at this. It puts you on your toes. That makes sense? What common fibular nerve does, it puts you on your heel. Understood? So, if common fibular nerve, that controls what's called dorsiflexion of your feet. If common fibular nerve does not work, tibial will override, and you're going to have what's called a foot jog. Actually, I can use Benjamin. Okay, so if this is a normal position of your foot, when common fibular is dysfunctional, your foot drops down. Does that make sense? If tibial nerve is dysfunctional, common fibular will take over, and you can do this. That makes sense? So basically, you can say that if your common fibular is damaged, you can walk on your toes. Okay? If your tibial is damaged, you're going to walk on your heels. It's a bit more complicated. When tibial is damaged, for instance, it's sort of shuffling gait. Right? Does that make sense? So that's the good list of the nerves that I can ask about on the exam. Any questions? Anatomically, as I mentioned, you have your pictures, you have your study. Last concept that I wanted to discuss before we grab the brains and do the group round. Concept of dermatomes. Starting from the neck and going down, anterior portion, posterior portion, your skin is innervated by branches of different spinal nerves. Right there. So I can say that approximately, if there is a strip of skin right here, if I touch that anywhere in that strip, the signal will reach my spinal cord via thoracic nerve 7. branches of thoracic nerve cell. Does that make sense to you? Like if that would be here, that would be thoracic nerve 2. We good? Why? Why do we care? If we can identify an area of the skin with what we call a paresthesia, abnormal sensation, and we can match that area of the skin to a particular dermatome, we can diagnose a dysfunction of a spinal nerve. Does that make sense? Is it precise? No. Obviously, you can't tell apart dermatome T6 and dermatome T7. Does that make sense? But you can tell apart dermatome T3 and dermatome T6. They far enough. Good? You can say, hang on a second, how do we do that? We have x-rays, we have MRIs. Well, not everywhere. Even in the United States, you can find areas that are pretty resource limited, and you need to identify, which part of the spine is damaged before you can get to an imaging. And I'm not even talking about third world countries where it may be out of the reach. Does that make sense? Now, what can you expect in regards to dermatomes on the exam? On the anatomy, you will see the dew. There's an image in the study guide, image of the dew with dermatomes. Does that make sense? So what I can ask you on the anatomy exam, there will be an arrow pointing at the dermatome, asking you the number, and we have 4 choices in the number. We clear? What I can ask you on the lecture, which of the following dermatomes is most likely to be found in cervical or thoracic? Does that make sense? Believe me, I ask you about, say, abdominal area. I'm not going to put T6, T7, or T8, because, yeah, all of them can be found in abdominal area. Got it? Good. Any questions? Okay. So things to kind of remember what you may be required to identify. Well, obviously, hemispheres, 4 hemispheres. On the photograph, be able to identify right and left. Am I clear? Okay. So, soldier crabs. Right. Okay, right and left hemisphere. You should be able to identify. By the way, during the anatomy exam, you will be allowed to use models. They will be on your desks. It's totally fine. If you want to position it just like it is on the picture, go for it. Okay. Pay close attention to cerebellum and cerebrum. Okay, makes sense. So cerebrum is pink, cerebellum is brown here. In cerebrum, I will not ask you to identify specific sulci or gyri. I will ask you, can ask you to identify, like, what is this? Gyrus. What is this? Sulcus. What is this? Median fissure. Does that make sense? So for white matter, basically one thing to know, corpus callosum. For diencephalon, know very clearly thalamus and hypothalamus. Okay, a little tiny bit hypothalamus, right? So my finger covers thalamus, and now the tip of my finger covers hypothalamus. This model, you can see this little tiny little bit. That's pituitary gland. Cerebellum. Inside of the cerebellum, the dark material, it's a gray matter of cerebellum. The white material is the white matter of cerebellum, also known as arbor vitae. The folds on the cerebellar surface are called folia, and the structure here that connects to hemispheres of cerebellum is called a vermen. And for brain fart, I'm sorry. For brainstem, yes. Midbrain, under my finger. Pons, medulla oblongata. Ventricles, 2 lateral ventricles. You need to be able to tell left and right apart. So the way you're looking at these now, mine, that's front. So that's how they are inside of the brain. Does that make sense? Yeah, that is a front part. So this is how you tell apart left and right. All right, good so far? Left and right ventricle on, that's lateral ventricle. So on each lateral ventricle, you have ventral horn, dorsal horn in the back, and ventral, that's ventral, yes. This is dorsal in the back, dorsal horn, and that is inferior horn. Okay. This one in the center, like, I don't know how to show it. Looks like yeah. Looks like a parrot head, sort of, bird's head. This is a third ventricle. And you see that third ventricle is connected to lateral ventricles. See that? There are like a couple of connections. Those are called interventricular framing. And finally here, you have fourth ventricle. This one. And fourth and third ventricle are connected by cerebral aqueduct. Good? That's all the more. So yeah, let me reiterate it again. If you will go on the blackboard and you will look at there is a homework study guide packet. It is massive, but you go to the end of it, there are images. There's a list of structures that you need to know. Just label. Okay, label, know where's what, and you'll be fine. And these pictures, they include photographs, actual photographs, that will be on the exam. I don't know how to stress it more. Literally, those same images that are in the homework packet will be on the exam. Okay? You will not see something. Questions? If no questions, then we're good. I'm not going to start talking about reflexes and ownership. Okay. So exam next week?